Günaydın. Good morning. It's a pleasure and an honor for me to be here speaking with you. In this session devoted to historical development and sources, I wanted to share with you two divergent paths. Can you hear me? Two divergent paths my work has taken. The study of patterns in carpets, and more broadly, the study of geometry in Islamic art. In considering historical development and sources, we must consider both the past and the present over time. And to view historical development, one relies on the privilege of hindsight, looking back. For my research as a historian of Islamic art, the primary sources are the monuments themselves. And of all the world cities, Istanbul, as capital of two great world empires, has probably the largest number of standing monuments remaining from the past and operating today. A richness and a legacy that cannot go unappreciated, but is too often underappreciated. Here, as elsewhere, the past continues to inform the present, and it inspires the future. For now is but a single moment not to be missed. So the now keeps changing over time. And as a historian of art, my interest is in that changing now, the cultural context, how a work of art emerges from a particular set of circumstances, and trying to figure out a way to understand the ways in which the monument or work of art embeds certain cultural values of its time. So let me start here with one of the oldest monuments I will discuss, a tomb tower in Harakhan in western Iran, one of more than 100 geometric patterns on this and its neighboring tower built 25 years later, both in the second half of the 11th century of our era, and related visually to one of the youngest, the very same geometric pattern, overlapping octagons, on the Galata Bridge, which crosses the Golden Horn, this railing, I think, from its construction in the early 20th century. And to point out that nearly every geometric pattern located on monuments of Islamic art, Beyazıt II Mosque, a lunette on the right, can be located earlier antecedents on monuments from other cultural milieus within the Islamic world. But before my work took me on the path of studying geometry in Islamic art, as we saw in my brief presentation yesterday, as curator at the Textile Museum in Washington, D.C., first I was studying carpet patterns with a specific focus on symmetry. Today, I would like to look at cultural context and point out that the term Oriental carpet is a Western term, for no one ever wove an Oriental carpet. They just wove a carpet, challah. So the term itself, Oriental carpet, signifies a transfer from one cultural context to another. And as I mentioned yesterday, one of the major producers of carpets historically was Turkey. Before the Republic of Turkey, even before the Ottoman Empire reached its greatest extent, Turks of the Seljuk Empire were major producers of carpets, and ethnically, Turks as both nomads and city dwellers across Central Asia and Iran have long been involved in carpet production. Today, however, I would like to shift my focus to the work that I have done in the last 10 years, which concerns explorations of the cultural context of some early geometric patterns in Islamic art, primarily from the middle of the 11th century and in the following 100 years before the Mongol conquests. These monuments and works of art continued to have impact on Seljuk and Ottoman arts and architecture. Before I begin this section, though, I want to dispel some commonly held myths, namely that geometric patterns are non-representational, abstract, decorative, and ornamental. The interpretation of ornament within the study of Islamic architectural history has undergone a profound reassessment during the past 150 years of Western scholarship. Owen Jones, born in 1809, died 1874, an English-born Welsh architect, visited the Alhambra in Andalusia, where he carefully documented and drafted architectural plans, sections, elevations, which he published using new techniques of chromolithography between 1836 and 1845. From these and his other studies of ornament, he developed his 37 Principles of Design, published in 1856 as the Grammar of Ornament. In this work, geometric patterns were removed from original cultural context and appropriated into an emerging European vocabulary of ornament. Here, the third floor of the reception room of the City Hall in Bilbao, which we visited with the Bridges Conference in Basque Country several years ago. But interestingly, Bilbao, in the northern part of Spain, in Basque Country, is a part of Spain never reached by Muslims. The City Hall reception room was built here in an Islamic style, showing its date of construction, 1890, using Owen Jones' Victorian designs and patterns. In Western Europe, from the time of the Renaissance, including Spain, what evolved was a view that ornament was ornamental, in contrast to the figural arts, landscapes, and pictorial narrative that became so typical of European art. In this context, in this European context, ornament was neither symbolic nor representational. Although Jones identified his sources, for example, naming them as Arabian, Turkish, Moresque, or Persian, among many others, the totality of Jones's work became a globalized source book for the study and use of color and design and pattern within European culture. No matter how beautiful or how meaningful in its original cultural context, what became the normative paradigm in the West and for the study of Islamic art in the West was that geometric patterns were considered to be decorative, repetitive, and abstract, in essence, non-representational and without meaning. At the same time, this interpretive paradigm was set within a European cultural backdrop of the 19th century, in which, at least mathematically speaking, Euclidean geometry was being succeeded by non-Euclidean geometry. And in any case, it was thought, geometry was ubiquitous, universal, and universally available for design. In my recent work, I have sought to re-examine the original Islamic cultural context of ornament, specifically in Iran and neighboring regions in the 11th and 12th centuries of our era, with a particular focus on 4 tomb towers. That, by the way, is Nasruddin Atusi and his colleagues under a dome, the drum of which has multiple geometric patterns. Focusing on 4 tomb towers spanning a little more than a century in their construction, from 1067 to 1197 by our counting. These 2 are the 2 tomb towers at Karahan. These 4 monuments serve as focal points for considering cultural expressions in fired brick and glazed ceramics, and offer a new interpretation of their meaning as geometry made manifest, which I will explain shortly. The earlier pair in Karakan of the second half of the 11th century, and the later two, Gumbadi Sork and Gumbadi Kabud, of which we see two details on the left, are the four monuments that I will be examining, and looking at the individual programs of geometric ornament and inscriptions, considering them within their own cultural context. So the kinds of questions that as an art historian I ask is what led to the building of such monuments, covered entirely in some cases with geometric pattern, and how were they perceived in their own time? I offer an interpretive paradigm that may guide an approach to understanding meaning, the meaning or meanings of ornament within cultural context, and an interpretation developed from within rather than an interpretation imposed from another intellectual tradition. Drawing upon diverse contemporary sources, that is, sources from the 11th and 12th century Iran and neighboring regions, in particular, mathematical treatises, historical texts, poetry, and Quranic exegesis, tafsir, and examining brick monuments that give evidence for the introduction of glazed ceramics. And here I want to point out, do we have a pointer? I want to point out in the far right, two tiny little bosses of glazed ceramic on either side of the arch of the later tower at Karakan, the Gumbadi Sork in the middle with the highlighting of nonagons in the tympanum above the entryway and the background of a threefold pattern in the spandrels above, and Gumbadi Kabud of the late 12th century with highlighting of turquoise ceramics. So these three monuments give a sense of the development. Before Karakan, the later tower, there is no use documented of glazed tiles or glazed brick, and after Gumbadi Kabud, there is extensively more use and the introduction of other colors. In Seljuk and post-Seljuk Iran, this paper proposes a vibrant and dynamic cultural matrix. In Seljuk and post-Seljuk Iran, this paper proposes a vibrant and dynamic cultural matrix in which architecture, mathematics, technology, poetry, philosophy, and theology all reach new and exciting levels of sophistication. This, by the way, is at Doris Duke's home in Honolulu, Hawaii. It's tiles that came originally, we think, from Takhti Suleiman, one of the early capitals of the Ilkhanids in western Iran, in Iranian Azerbaijan. I argue that these cultural interactions led to new forms of expression, such that the Persian historian Juzjani, who was historian of the Delhi Sultanate in India following the Ghurids, he referred to geometry made manifest. Now, I've turned his phrase around. He actually said, Hich muhandasi neshan nadade ast, which literally means of which no geometrician has made manifest. And this has been taken just as an expression, an exaggeration of what a building looked like. But I've taken it to mean that, hey, geometricians were making geometry manifest. Hiç mühendisi nişan nadade ast takes on a new meaning, very literal, for our understanding of these geometric patterns. He was writing in the 13th century about the Ghurid capital at Firuzkoh that was capital in the 12th century. Counter to the paradigmatic Western notion that geometry is ubiquitous and universal, I have sought to establish a moment in time when the histories of architecture and mathematics intersect. And I've argued that this extraordinary intersection led to some of the most amazing new developments in the history of ornament, the significance of which is only now beginning to emerge with advances in the fields of mathematics, chemistry, and physics. We'll return to this slide shortly. In 2011, the Nobel Prize in Chemistry was awarded to Daniel Shechtman, a fellow member of the International Society for the Interdisciplinary Study of Symmetry. He is credited with having discovered what came to be called quasi-crystals, or with quasi-periodic crystals with quasi-periodic patterning in natural alloys of metals, which seemed to exhibit patterns that violated the natural laws of symmetry. Of the 17 symmetry groups, plane symmetry groups, identified by crystallographers in the late 19th century and accepted by mathematicians, all are present in the Alhambra Palace in Granada. Here, the drawings of M.C. Escher. But such repetitions are all based on relationships of angles of the right isosceles triangle, 45, 45, 90 degrees, and half an equilateral triangle, 30, 60, 90 degrees, identified by Said as a root 2 and a root 3 system. Think engineers or architects' triangles still today. These angles are all factors of 360 degrees of the circle, whereas pentagons and decagons, that is 5-sided figures, and 10-sided figures do not follow the same rules and cannot tessellate the plane themselves in a grid, that is, cover the plane with no gaps and no overlaps. Surprisingly, some of the quasi-crystalline patterns discovered by Shechtman, in which local symmetries of pentagons and decagons play a part, are also present in Islamic architecture in Iran and appear in monuments constructed both before and after the devastation of the Mongol conquests of the 13th century. And here I may point out, my research revealed that the Meragheh tomb of the Gumbad-i Kabud is a decagonal prism, not octagonal as published by so many authors, including major works. And so Peter Liu's reconstruction of the patterns around the shaft of the monument need to now be extended 2 more to 9. Only the front face does not have this pattern represented. So I was so fascinated by my discovery of this fact that I published an article called Taking Sides, But Who's Counting? And looking at the tomb at Meragheh in architectural context. So I have focused in particular on Gumbad-i Kabud of the late 12th century. And I just bring to your attention also with pentagonal and decagonal patterns also within that quasi-periodic repetition, the Darbe Imam in Isfahan of the 15th century, but that's beyond the period in which I have focused my research. If we look at the architectural heritage of the Gumbad-i Kabud, it suggests a methodical development in the experiential use of bricks to create geometric patterns, from variations in horizontal and vertical orientation, as we see here at Demavend, the use of projection and recess, and the use of cut proportions of bricks from 1 to 2 to 3, as well as the use of a 1 to 2 to 3. The 1 in is red, the 2 in blue, and the 3 in yellow, to the use of modular elements to create more complex patterns. And this is the earliest use of modularity that I have located in the middle of the 12th century. The 3 elements used to create the entire pattern shown overall and extended on the lower right. And the brilliance of these artisans is that they took the intersecting dodecagons, which you only see in clay, and overlaid all of the joins of the modular connections. So you're really using technology brilliantly to bring out the intersection of three polygonal networks. The nonagons are highlighted in turquoise glaze, and I think this is immensely significant. But at the same time, they are in polygonal networks with overlapping octagons and overlapping dodecagons. This is a uniquely complex pattern, also the earliest of its type that I have found. And J, it has oscillating squares in a different proportion than what you showed us yesterday. But the various analyses of the tympanum of the later tower at Harakan is what I published last year in Nexus Network Journal, showing in the upper right the arrangement of the symmetry, showing parallel and perpendicular glide reflections, and by connecting centers of pentagons, you can establish a vertical orientation of a hexagonal network as well as a horizontal orientation of a hexagonal network. And playing with the pattern, you can find all manner of patterns that appear subsequently in Islamic architecture. So my sense is, barring the finding of further evidence, which of course always may result, this is the earliest example, the later tower at Harakan, 1096, that provides this kind of experiential question mark playing with pattern. And you see here, by dividing the overlapping hexagonal networks, we see a non-regular pentagon tessellating the plane. A third example of such extraordinary patterns is shown by a reflection of hexagons, of heptagons, seven-sided figures, in the Friday Mosque at Mesjid-i-Jome Isfahan in central Iran, published by Jan Hogendijk, a mathematician at the University of Utrecht, who is also a professor of Hussein Shen. Each of these examples resonates very closely with treatises that are important to the history of mathematics, which Reza Sarhangi mentioned to us yesterday, the book on what is needed by craftsmen by Abu Wafa Buzjani, and the anonymous treatise appended to one manuscript of his work now in the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris. Indeed, one craftsman whose patron was Nur ad-Din Azenji, ruling from Damascus, is described by the 13th century biographer Ibn Abi Usaybiya as having studied with a mathematician, Sharaf ad-Din Atusi, who taught Kamal ad-Din ibn Yunus, who taught Nasr ad-Din Atusi. Sharaf ad-Din was considered to be outstanding and at the forefront of mathematics in his time. This craftsman, a woodworker, was described as muhandis, a title later used to refer to architect or engineer. And he must have been related to the woodworker, also from Aleppo, and also also under the employ of Nur ad-Din Azenji, responsible for the design of the mimbar that was commissioned to be built in Aleppo and transported to Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem once the city was restored to Muslim rule after the Crusades. Imagine the importance of such a work in its time. No doubt it would have been the pride of an entire generation at the forefront of all that was being worked on in the late 12th and early 13th century, just before the Mongol conquests. Geometry, ilm al-handasa, is both knowledge of geometry and the science of geometry. It is a genitive possessive construction from a Middle Persian loanword, andaza, and the title muhandis reflects an Arabic, not a Persian, grammatical construction applied to a Persian loanword, as if it were an Arabic quadriliteral verb, or Arabic verb with a quadriliteral root. References to geometry also abound in contemporary poetry. Sanai, who was poet laureate of the Ghaznavid court that Jay Bonner spoke with us about yesterday, likened, quote, the ability to behold the divine manifestation to the intellectual way of perception of a geometrician. He said, you only see with your imagination and your senses when you have not learned about lines, planes, and points. Tu nabini juz as khiyal u khavas, chun naikhat u sat u nukya shinas. I hope I've said that. You say it better. You say it better. Oh, I have it written in transcription. Okay. Tu nabini, you don't see. Okay. Juz as khiyal, in imagination, va khavas. Chun, except for neichat, lines, u sat, u nukya. Nukta. So that was Sanai, and he was poet laureate of the Ghaznavid Empire in what is today Afghanistan. With Quranic exegesis and philosophical discourse, there are many more references to suggest early endeavors to establish even a theory of numbers, often with spiritual connotations more fully articulated in the work of Ibn Arabi in the 13th century. Today's history of mathematics is beginning to uncover newly understood relationships between geometry and algebra, with explorations in the 11th and 12th century in Iran that long predate similar developments in the work of Descartes and Fermat. Sorry, that was to go with Sanai's poetry, the Ghaznavid Tower, and the Azerbaijani architect of the tomb of Ibn Yusuf in Nakhchivan. But these efforts long predate the work of Fermat and Descartes in the 17th century. Rushdie Rashed, a historian of mathematics based in Paris, has described the mathematics of this period, that is the 11th and 12th centuries. Al-Khwarizmi's successors undertook a systematic application of arithmetic to algebra, algebra to arithmetic, both of them to trigonometry, algebra to the Euclidean theory of numbers, algebra to geometry, and geometry to algebra. This was how the geometric construction of equations arose. In essence, as I understand this passage and from what I can understand of the mathematics at the time, efforts were to make algebra visible through geometry. I also have a quote from Omar Khayyam, who was moving in the same direction before Sharaf ad-Din at-Tusi, and he wrote, "Whoever thinks algebra is a trick in obtaining the unknowns has thought it in vain. No attention should be paid to the fact that algebra and geometry are different in appearance. Algebra is geometric facts which have been proved." Points, lines, and planes. Angles in the monuments of Karakan and Merakeh, among others in Seljuk and post-Seljuk Iran before the Mongol conquest, represent exceptional efforts and experiments to explore the plane in ways that correlate with contemporary mathematical treatises, as well as with references to geometry and poetry. The resulting patterns seem to engage in a visual discourse concerning what was then contemporary mathematical thinking and the introduction of new mathematical ideas expressed visually. The play with patterns in the plane complements three-dimensional prismatic forms of the monuments with their polyhedral roofing arrangements, and I suspect that the development of Muqarnas fits in also with the development of understanding three-dimensional solid geometry. Scholarship on the Islamic architecture of Iran in the 20th century has often reflected Western prejudices, including notions that geometric patterns are abstract, repetitive, non-representational, bearing no meaning, and purely ornamental. Framing the interpretation of ornament as ornamental is a discourse based in the academic disciplines on the histories of art and architecture in the West, which, from my perspective, may have precluded cultural understanding of geometric patterns within their original cultural contexts. If geometric ornament is examined within this particular cultural context, in relation to other forms of cultural expression, including Quranic inscriptions on monuments, exegesis and commentary, poetry, and mathematical treatises, we may chart a new course for the study of pattern as lines of mathematical thought expressed visually. Two final points. Abdus Salam received the Nobel Prize in Physics in 1979, and he quoted a verse from the Quran, from Surat al-Mulk, in his acceptance speech. He called this the physicist's verse. This is the very same passage that was selected to be inscribed in the monument at Gumbad-e Kabud in Maragha. And Surat al-Mulk is also the chapter which Sinan, in his final endowment, requested to be read aloud for his benefit every night after prayer. Finally, at the time of Sinan, mother-of-pearl work was a means of training in the science of geometry, and that is explained in amazing detail in a treatise written by Sinan's student Mimar Mehmet Agha and written down by Jafer Effendi. Mehmet Agha was the chief architect who built the Sultan Ahmet Mosque. The author explains how novices were educated in a carpentry workshop located in the imperial garden of Topkapi Palace, and its trainees were generally promoted to the corps of royal architects. As long as a person does not understand this agreeable science, he is not capable of the finest working of mother of pearl, Sedefkar, and nor can he be expert and skilled in the art of architecture. Thank you.